Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and thank you for joining this session. When we talk about migrating from on-prem to the cloud, the biggest shift is usually not about tech, but more about infrastructure. Um, On-prem, you're limited to physical hardware, rack spaces, and cables, while on the cloud, it's more about everything being instant and virtual, which is really good, but at the same time, it can be dangerous if you bring in your old habits. My name is Ike, and as an engineer that has lived through that transition, I want to talk about the realities of what happened after migrating to the cloud, and I'm going to be sharing some of the pitfalls that team encounter during or after the migration. So, for example, pitfalls like wire handling out broad admin access could lead to some security headaches, or just manually making changes in the console instead of using cloud formation templates to just provide an application that can be repeatable and trackable. And also, why treating observability as an afterthought instead of enabling CloudWatch from day one, that can come back to bite you. Okay, let's get into it. So one of the major pitfalls that most organizations face is or teams is over permissioning. So once you migrate a new application to the cloud, there's always that temptation to want to just give permissions to like everyone, just a broad admin, even as far as removing those wildcards from the JSON policies so that everything can work. In the cloud, this can be dangerous because this could lead to some, data leaks and escalation privileges. So can you imagine one of your engineers, being able to escalate their own permissions and, provisioning extra resources using CloudFormation? That's possible with, escalation privileges. So we want to, resist the urge to choose convenience over security and lock down permissions from day one, even if you have to take an extra step, in doing that. So what are the recommended approach, in handling, over permission? The first here is, applying least privileges. So with least privilege, you basically just, granting permissions for what that particular user, or group of users or roles, on what actions they can perform. So first of all, you can just start with, broad, permissioning, and based on your use case, you can fine tune and tighten up permissions by reducing permissions over time. And one good way you can actually do that is using starting off with AWS managed policies, right? So with AWS managed policies, you have if you log into the console now, you're going to see a lot of common use cases that you can use AWS managed policies. So what you can actually do, you can actually copy those AWS managed policies into a custom policy. So by then, you can actually, reduce the permissions and, implement, those permissions for your own, workload or for your own environment. Then thirdly, you can also use Access Analyzer too. So the way Access Analyzer works is basically it generates policies based on user access activity on CloudTrail. So you can set it up where you can look at the historical data or a specific range of what type of permissions or actions or resources that have been accessed by certain users. Then the Access Analyzer will generate a policy template, and from that policy template, you can generate policies that you can also fine tune. And depending on your workload, you can apply that to the user or group of users. In addition to that, also too, if you're working in a centralized managed environment, like where you have like organization and you have a different accounts and hierarchies, you can actually use the service control policies. So with service control policies, it enables access to AWS resources, services, and regions within that organization. So the thing with service control policies is it doesn't grant permissions. It just sets the maximum limit to what that user can use or what actions they can perform. The user needs to have the IAM role and permissions assigned, but with the SCP, right, you can just maximum what actions they can perform in the console. Okay, pitfall two. I think so manually configuring everything. I think everybody goes through this, right? If you've lifted and shifted an application to the cloud, the first thing you want to do is just log into the console and just make changes, right? So it's like one engineer is making launching an EC2 instance, another engineer is setting up firewall, another engineer is setting up security group. So a lot of things are happening right at the same time, and there's no way you can track the changes, the why, the where, the who is going to be difficult for you to actually handle. So the issue here is that without coordination on automation, right, the circle continues. It's limitless, right, and that could lead to increased human errors, repetitive tasks, and just compliance and security risk. So, for example, if you work in an industry where compliance and auditing is a requirement, it's going to be hard for you to track who is making these changes, especially when you're manually making these changes from time to time. So everything needs to go through CloudFormation templates, right? Because it's reusable, repeatable, it's trackable, and version controlled. But more importantly, it becomes your main source of truth, right? So any change that's happening, right, or occurring, you can look at the CloudFormation template to know what's changed. So, for example, let's say you have a new engineer join your team, right? If you are manually making all those changes, it's going to be hard for them to know what change is happening or what's occurring. But when you look at CloudFormation, they will know the resources being provisioned or the settings and configurations that are in place. So the recommended approach here is to use CloudFormation. Then pitfall 3, it's delayed maybe 1 or 2 folks here must have had that thought process like, oh, you know what, we've migrated to the cloud. You know what, let's get this thing deployed first, right? We'll worry about logging and alerting later. But the problem here is that right after migration, right, that's when exactly things start to break, right? So if you don't have any tool, or let's say CloudWatch turned on, right, you're not going to know if there are any issues, right? It'll be difficult for you to actually have an actionable insight into how your application is performing, right? Because your application is down. So the worst thing that can happen to you is having a production outage and realizing that you don't have metrics, you don't have logs, you don't have traces to actually troubleshoot the root cause of the issue. So the recommendation approach here from day one is enable CloudWatch, and with CloudWatch, right, it's an observability tool for you to have understanding about the data or the performance of data in your application. And out of the box, CloudWatch provides some metrics that you can follow, things like your CPU utilization, your networking, and network out, right? But if you want to take it further, you can install like a CloudWatch agent. So that will provide more additional metrics to what you already have. So the approach here is CloudWatch from day one. The next pitfall is just neglecting backup and recovery. So basically, I think there's always going to be that misconception between what's cloud replication and what's data backup or recovery, right? So with cloud replication, right, it's going to protect your entire data center when it goes down. So if one data center goes down, right, of course, it's going to replicate to the other data center, right? But the issue with cloud replication is if there is a ransomware attack, right, or if let's say your engineer mistakenly, drops a particular table, that will be replicated to the other environments or to the other data centers or to the other regions, right? So now you have an issue where data is being lost. So the approach here is, or what teams you should be using first of all is set up AWS backup. Although you can set up snapshots, right? But the issue with snapshots is it's one thing for you to set up snapshots, but it's another thing for you to test those snapshots, right? So what teams usually do is just set up snapshots and forget about it, but you're not actually testing your snapshots. So that's where AWS backup comes in. So with AWS backup, right, it provides a centralized way to protect your data across, accounts and region. So now your backup strategy is going to involve not just, backing up your data, but also testing the restoration. So it's recommended that, you can set up like, let's say, monthly drills, or let's say first in a week of, every month, to test up those snapshots that, you have backed up. And AWS backup can do that, it can be automated, that process can be automated for them to like, back up, your data and test it as, and it's working as expected. Okay. And lastly, pitfall is cloud cost optimization. So I think there is always that. So when it comes to ignoring cloud cost optimization, right? There is always that temptation to bring that mindset into AWS also too, right? So the cloud charges you for what you allocate, but not the actual use, right? So if you're spending up a massive instance of EC2, right, that sits at 5% utilization, right, or leave a use stage in the database running over the weekend, right, when nobody's working, right, you're basically just throwing money away. So what you should be doing here is just setting up AWS budgets that can also track like some anomalies and set up some alerts, right, if you go above like a certain threshold. So there are a lot of like AWS native tools that you can use. You can even use some service plans for your EC2s. You can use AWS budget that will set up alerts in case you go over certain threshold. So if your organization or team is all in on AWS, right, you can use these tools. But let's say if you have you're operating a multi-cloud architecture, right, there are some other third-party tools that you can use. For example, IBM has a very good tool called Turbonomics that helps effectively in resizing. So you can recommend resizing some of your instances, or even just cleaning up unused instances. So there are a lot of like good third-party tools that you can use to actually make you save costs while on the cloud. Thank you so much for attending this session. Thanks.